this podcast, Justin Borgman from Starburst talks about his entrepreneurial journey to raising a startup in data warehousing space. So, stay tuned. Welcome everyone to another episode of Future of Data podcast. Today we have with us Justin Borgman. A brief bio. Justin has spent a better part of a decade in his senior executive roles building new businesses in the data warehousing and analytics space. Prior to co-founding Starburst, Justin was vice president and general manager at Teradata, where he was responsible for company's portfolio of Hadoop products. Prior to joining Teradata, Justin was co-founder and CEO of Adapt, the pioneer SQL on Hadoop company that transformed Hadoop from file system to analytic database accessible to anyone with a BI tool. Adapt was acquired by Teradata in 2014. Justin has earned a BS in computer science from University of Massachusetts at Amherst and an MBA from Yale School of Management. With that, Justin, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So let's talk about your journey. I think it's if you can walk our viewers and listeners through your grad days, what bring you here, what brought you to the startup journey, and then that will be amazing.
Sure. So began my career actually as a software engineer. My undergrad was in computer science. I became a software developer. My first job was actually at Raytheon, and then I worked at a place called MIT Lincoln Lab. Focused on communication satellites, actually, and did that for a number of years. But always wanted to be an entrepreneur and really wanted to try to, round out my own knowledge of sort of how one would even do that, and decided to go to business school. And it was really while I was in business school that I met my co-founders from my first company, Adapt. They were in the computer science department. I was working on an MBA. And I basically read a paper by a guy named Daniel Abadi, who was a professor there at the time. He just moved to University of Maryland, and his PhD student, Camille Bajda-Pawlikowski. And their paper was something called Hadoop DB, which at the time, this was like 2009, 2010, was a pretty fascinating concept. Basically, they envisioned Hadoop becoming really a data warehousing system, an analytical database system. And in order to do that, you'd have to give it an SQL interface and really give it the performance and functionality of a database system. So I coming from a software background, read that paper, thought it was really cool, and walked over to the computer science department, met those guys, and said, hey, I think we should commercialize this. And fortunately, was able to convince them to do that with me. And so we spun it out of the university and went on to raise some venture capital and moved up to Boston and built that business over about 4 years, and then ultimately sold that to Teradata. So that's how I ended up at Teradata.
Interesting. And so tell us about that decision of leaving, finishing your grad school and then starting a company. It's a grunt work. So what were your findings then, and what helped you take the plunge and go for it? We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
Yeah. I think, it definitely did feel like a big, bold move at the time. Maybe in retrospect, seems like a smarter decision. But at the time, I remember having some conversations with my parents about this. And my mom in particular was not super in favor of me. I actually left business school before finishing. I later went back and officially earned the degree just to make her happy. But at the time, I actually took a leave of absence to go do this full time. And so it was a pretty big step. But I think what really encouraged me was just what I saw happening in sort of the big data space. And big data itself was really a pretty new term at the time. Big data companies at that point were companies like Vertica, Greenplum, Netezza. It was sort of that generation. And Cloudera was really brand new. They had raised money maybe a few months prior to that. And so Hadoop was just starting to gain some speed, but I think what was so appealing about it was the fact that it was open source. It could really scale to handle major amounts of data, and certainly we all knew about data volumes growing broadly. And I think the key that really got me excited was the notion that, SQL, is sort of the language that enterprises have been speaking for decades in terms of how they access their data. So even though Hadoop was a new disruptive technology, I felt that SQL as a language was going to be critical to making it useful for a broader enterprise audience. And that was exactly what Daniel's research represented to me. And that was exactly what was so exciting. So I got really encouraged, I think, about just the market opportunity. And that was enough, at least for me, to sort of take that risk and take a leave of absence from the university and ultimately, go full time on Adapt.
Interesting. And so, tell me about your perception of perception versus reality when it comes to starting a big data or data warehousing startup, right? So, when you plunged into this venture, Adapt, and what were you thinking, and what you ended up what were your takeaways on some of the challenges or some of the opportunities that you think that you have gained over the time span that you're building this company?
Mm-hmm. Well, it was a tremendous learning experience on multiple levels. I think just, some of the things that you have to learn to run a company of any kind, whether it's database related or not, in terms of managing teams, raising capital, building a go-to-market, building and running a sales organization. All of those are just tremendous learning experiences, and I don't think you can learn them by reading a book or taking a class. Even though I was in business school, I think most of that learning actually was experiential. Just doing that job and learning it the hard way. As far as the database space specifically, it's definitely challenging. I mean, you have some very large incumbent vendors, Oracle, IBM, Teradata, of course, as well. So you're competing with the incumbents. You're also competing with startups. And during that particular period of time, the startups were raising an exceptional amount of capital, and that's still going on today. But certainly prior to that period, that was not the case. I think Vertica raised maybe like $30 million over the entire life of the business and sold for $300 million, which was an incredible outcome for them. But conversely, at that point in time, Cloudera, ultimately went on to raise well over $1 billion for an open source software company. So that was sort of a whole nother element of challenge, I think, for us. We raised about 17 million in venture capital, which we thought was a lot of money. But when you saw, some of these other vendors raising absurd amounts of capital, that became a challenge for us as well. They could build much larger sales teams. They could go to market much more aggressively than we could. And they could really subsidize their product offerings because they had so much capital to work with. So those are all sort of challenges that I guess I probably couldn't have predicted at the time, or certainly didn't predict. But ultimately, we wrestled with.
Interesting. And one thing sort of I grapple with a lot is, so data warehousing is a very deep trenches of IT, right? So every business is very core and near and dear to that. We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast. Their data and the solutions. And how would a startup, or like what was the experience of a startup disrupting that space and getting in and saying, hey, no, let me help you with analytical modeling of or creating those models on the BI frameworks, and you will get more data from that. How was that experience of really convincing these IT legacy folks to try something new?
Yeah, great question. Well, I would say actually it probably first starts with trying your stuff out on some smaller customers first, just to make sure it works, and also I think earning some good testimonials before you'll probably get a large company to pull the trigger with you and sign a deal. For us, I probably shouldn't disclose the name, but we had a very large insurance company that became our first big customer at Adapt in probably the summer of 2011. So, shortly after we joined, and that was a major win for us, both in terms of dollar value, but also proving that we could win those very large enterprises. And I think to answer your question, sort of why did they pick us? I think it's because we were doing something nobody else was doing at the time. And so I think, if you're going to convince a large company to work with a small company, you have to be doing something particularly innovative, something that they just can't find somewhere else. Because the the traditional playbook for an incumbent vendor, like for example, that particular customer was a big IBM shop, right? So the typical playbook is the IBM sales rep says, yeah, we're building that. Yeah, we can do that. No problem. And that's super common. So I think as a startup, that's what you have to contend with. And your offering better be sufficiently compelling and differentiated, and you've got to be able to convince the customer that they need this, and they're not going to be able to find it anywhere else. And I think for us, at least at that particular period of time, we were really the only ones with a compelling SQL engine for Hadoop. Hive was the only alternative, and Hive was very slow, was batch oriented. So it was a pretty compelling differentiation there. And also, I would say there's a little bit of luck involved too, because we were fortunate that the buyer, this sort of data IT architect on the customer side, was very visionary. He wanted to do something aggressive and new and different, and ultimately save his company a lot of money, which he did. I think it worked out well for him. But you need to find sort of those champions as well, those folks who are thinking forward and want to take some risks.
Interesting. And to entrepreneurs who are listening, or who are sort of watching this, what are some of the hacks you could suggest to get a seat on the table, where you have these like these visionaries, these early adapters, or anyone who can take a chance with the startup with a very innovative and very sort of creative way to do a very disruptive thing? So what would you suggest to those guys?
Well, I would say do a lot of networking. And what I mean by that is, go to meetups, go to conferences. You'll generally find, I think, the more progressive, visionary minded on the customer side who attend these things. They want to learn about what's new. They're engaged. They're interested. Those are the right people to meet. The ones who never get out of the shop, probably aren't as aware of these new technologies anyhow, and probably aren't the best prospect for you. So, network your butt off, try to meet those visionary folks who are thinking about what's next. I think that's one important step. And then, as a more tactical matter, one fear that big companies have of doing business with small companies is this idea that the small company may go out of business, and then what do they do with the product? It's no longer supported. How do they operate this thing? Their money just went, totally to waste. And one tactical way you can mitigate that is offer to put it in escrow, put the source code in escrow. If it's a proprietary product, if it's open source, you actually have a little bit of an easier time, because you can say, look, it's open source anyways. You have access to the source code. If it's proprietary, offer to put it into an escrow, and the escrow agreement would just say, if the company, in our case, Adapt, let's say, went out of business, then that customer would have access to the source code and have, the rights to be able to use that in perpetuity, going forward. So sometimes that will get people over the hump and make them feel sufficiently comfortable taking that risk.
Interesting. And getting your first few customers, I think that's always very critical for any business, right? So, because we hear a lot of stories about folks diluging into something totally different because the customer demands, and it's derailing them from their traditional, typical visionary roadmap cycles. What has been your experience with that? Like finding a right customer vis-a-vis a wrong customer. Like, how could one ensure that the customer that you get are the right customer, and you are doing anything and everything to help them, or like, what are your thoughts on that?
I guess a couple thoughts on that. First of all, I would try to find customers who are at a particular inflection point in terms of needing to make a decision and make a transition from one solution to another. It's very hard to just sort of go in and rip and replace one solution and replace it with another if there isn't a burning need to do so. So an example today might be an organization makes the decision to go from on-prem into the cloud. That's a very common decision, I think, being discussed, pretty much universally in all enterprises today. And that's a really wonderful catalyst, I think, for a new vendor to come in and say, okay, so now you've decided you're going to the cloud. What are the things that you need to be successful in the cloud? And if you have an offering there, I think that's a compelling event to drive a decision process. So I would sort of try to look for companies who are at that point in time where there is some kind of transition being driven. I guess in addition to that, another piece of advice I would give is always try to remain focused. I think there's also a very common, I guess, sort of attraction to doing whatever will pay the bills. So, a customer may come to you and say, I need X, but really you're in the business of building Y. And it can be very enticing to go out and build X for them because there's dollars associated with that. But every time you do that, you distract yourself from your core mission, and you're losing time ultimately. And your engineering resources, represent, opportunity cost. If you deploy them on something that is not core to your business, you're really wasting time. And time is critical. Whether you're venture backed, then time is a very real thing. Or even if you're not venture backed, you're still competing against others in your space who ultimately believe in the same kind of vision. And it's going to be a race to see who can fulfill that vision first. So I think that would be another piece of advice. Even if you find a customer that you think is great, but what they're offering or what they want from you is not what you really want to build, you might have to say no, and that can be tough.
Interesting. And so I think you raised an interesting point about being venture backed. So in case of Adapt, and then what were some of the indicators that say, hey, let me or as an entrepreneur building a data warehousing or big data or data analytics company, what are some of the indicators that points me to, hey, now is the time to maybe I should go and get some venture help? What are your thoughts and take on that?
Yeah, sure. And it's interesting. Adapt and Starburst, sort of my new company, are very different in this respect. There's a good compare and contrast there. But with respect to Adapt, I mean, ultimately, we were building a proprietary product at that point in time, and the development we were doing was truly new, cutting edge. We filed 6 or 7 patents over that period of time. There was a lot of heavy lifting, a lot of rocket science that we were trying to invent and put into that product. And so there really wasn't any conceivable way that we could think of how we would bootstrap that business. So we really needed capital up front. And for us, I think, we had a proof of or a prototype, I should say, of our product that came from the research that was done at Yale. And we used that with a few small early customers to sort of prove out the value proposition. And that ultimately helped us to go raise initially a seed financing. We raised about $1.5 million originally. And then we did a much larger $9.5 million round from Bessemer and Norwest to ultimately grow the business and build the product out. So I think in our case, we felt like we had to do that just given the scale and nature of the product that we were building. Another reason to potentially raise capital beyond that is to scale out your go-to-market. So eventually, if you're trying to scale your business, you need to hire sales reps, and there's quite a bit of upfront cost associated with ramping up that go-to-market. So that's another reason to potentially raise capital.
Interesting. And regarding having co-founders, I think so. This is one of the another thing that we have been really asked from our community members was, hey, who should I hire as a co-founder? It's always a struggle. What are your key takeaways? Like what you were lucky to have someone from business background and few people from technical background. What's your magic sauce when it comes to putting together a company that is selling to, say, enterprise client like data warehousing folks? We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
I think the biggest thing I would say is try to find people with complementary skill sets. You don't want 3 people who do the same exact thing. That's sort of redundancy and a lot of equity, quite frankly, on the cap table that's overlapping. So I think the key is trying to find different people who complement one another, where the skills don't have a lot of overlap. In my case, I was the quote unquote business guy, even though I came from a technical background. My co-founders were, vastly superior to me in terms of their technical depth. So I handled the business aspects. Daniel was just, a total visionary from a database perspective, and added a lot of value both in terms of our thought leadership and our architecture, and actually has a great intuition for sort of what the market is looking for as well. And then Camille was the PhD student who had actually built this prototype. And so from an operational day-to-day perspective, he was really important to our engineering efforts. And actually, over the course of Adapt, it developed into really a great, great mind for sort of solution architecture. I would say he's actually great with customers now as well. So again, just try to find people that complement you rather than overlap.
Interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that takeaway. Another thing to talk about is seed, right? So getting yourself into seed first, and then raising a serious round there after that. So what are some of the from your vantage point, what are some of the advantages of going seed, and vis-a-vis of just straight going to say Series A? So what's your take on that?
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, I'd say sometimes you can't raise a Series A right away. Sometimes the bigger investors won't take you seriously yet. You haven't de-risked the venture sufficiently. And really, from their standpoint, I think it's all about mitigating and managing risk. That's sort of their job. That's the way they think about things, weighing the opportunity versus the risk associated with it. So I think seed rounds offer a great opportunity, really probably for both sides, to be able to de-risk the venture and prove it out. And so in our case, I mentioned that very large insurance company that we won. That was during our seed round. We had raised 1.5 initially. We started to build out the product. The team was still very small. We were, probably less than 10 people, almost exclusively engineering. I was the only one selling at that point in time. And, we were able to close that very large insurance company, which was a great deal for us. And that ultimately triggered a very competitive round for us for the Series A. A lot of venture capitalists suddenly became very interested once they saw that happen. And that drove, a good valuation for us and ultimately a good Series A fundraising process. So I think it's an opportunity for you to sort of prove yourself, and it's an opportunity for Series A investors to see some risk taken out of the business.
Interesting. And so now considering you're onto your second startup, and then you have and we'll talk about a later part about your journey through sort of your exit and then coming out. So one of the thing so when it comes to going for a seed round or going for a Series A round, were there any sort of qualifiers that, hey, I'm ready? Like if I hit A, B, and C, then probably I'm ready for the series, and if I do C, D, and E, probably I'm ready for Series A. Like, do you have any thoughts on those?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely important to set milestones for yourself, and also, assuming you're confident in hitting those milestones, communicate those with your potential investors as well. Because I think another part of reinforcing risk being removed from the business and also building trust with investors is saying, I'm going to do X, and then you actually do X, and they say, okay, wow, this team can deliver on what they promise. So I think setting milestones is important. I think for us, I'm trying to remember back then, I think probably our first milestones were really, I think, just to get some early beta customers and finish kind of the first version of the product. And I think that was really our goal. And so I think actually winning that insurance company was kind of a bonus to us. I don't think we would have expected to get a deal that large at that point in time with such an awesome particular company. So I think that was a bonus. I think also another milestone for us was building out the team. So we hired a VP of engineering. We added some people to the board. We added some people to our advisors, board of advisors as well. And all of that, I think, started to, strengthen the overall team and ability to execute on our vision. So those are sort of our seed milestones. Series A, I think, became far more commercially oriented. I think we had some revenue targets, customer targets, and those were sort of the milestones for the next raise. But I think, every time you raise money, you want to have a clear goal in mind. And you want to also make sure that you can achieve that goal in the time frame that capital provides. And for most people, that's maybe 18 months, let's say, of runway. So you want to make sure you can do that. Yep.
And so and we get this mixed responses from a lot of entrepreneurs in our community about having a good advisory sort of when you're early, get good advisors to help your company. I want your perspective on what's your definition of a good advisor. Like, what do you call if someone is helping me, if it checks that boxes, probably I'll add him to my advisory. Or what's your thoughts?
I think they can take a lot of different roles. I think it could be someone on the customer side who understands the value proposition that you're trying to deliver on, so that they might be able to provide great product input. And so from that standpoint, that's valuable. It could be someone who's particularly well connected in the industry and maybe will be able to offer introductions as you need them as you grow the business. So that would be another reason. I think, a third reason, and this is probably the most important in my mind for any first-time CEO or first-time founder, is to find somebody who has a lot of operating experience in those kinds of environments. And I was very lucky to have actually 3 tremendous mentors in that respect. Early on, someone named Shamila Mulligan, who was the chief marketing officer at Astrodata at the time, and is just a total rock star from a marketing standpoint. Later, a guy named Jit Saxena, who was the CEO and founder of Netezza and is also amazing. And then Chris Lynch, who was the CEO of Vertica, who spent a lot of time with me and taught me probably everything I know about sort of sales and marketing.
All great guys, and
yeah,
kudos to even Chris Lynch. He has been helping us in our journey as well. So amazing guy, and couldn't say it any better. So that's beautiful. So now let's talk about slightly more mature company, got through the venture funding and all, exits. So tell us what are some of, from your vantage point, whatever you can share, So Teradata, what was it exit? Why? What is the thinking that went into it as an entrepreneur running this venture? And if you can just walk us through, what are some of the takeaways from that?
Mm-hmm. I think for us, it was a pretty opportunistic decision at the time. I think there were both market challenges for us in terms of the emerging open source alternatives, I would say, to what we had built, right? So we had built a proprietary SQL engine. It was really the first, I would say, production enterprise grade SQL engine. We thought it was the best, enterprise grade SQL engine, but it quickly became not the only one. Cloudera introduced Impala. Hortonworks over time made Hive, better and better. But I would say Impala was probably the biggest impact to us. When Cloudera introduced that as free and open source and included in the distribution, it was sort of like, Netscape and Internet Explorer in the 90s, right? Like suddenly Internet Explorer comes with Windows. And, that was an important inflection point for Netscape, I think, as a company. I think that was one challenge for us in terms of lengthening sales cycles. And, we now had to compete with free, which is just a very different challenge that we hadn't been competing with. Prior to that, we were competing with other actually more expensive traditional database systems, the Verticas, Green Plunge, the Netezza, and so forth. So that was a big change for us. But simultaneous to that, we were having some really good partnership discussions with some of the larger vendors that ultimately turned into acquisition interest, and decided at the time that the offer on the table was worth taking, particularly in light of just the additional venture capital that the other Hadoop players had raised, and how much more we felt like we would have to go raise, which just sort of raises the stakes in terms of being able to get a really good outcome at the end. So we took what was on the table, and I think it was the right decision.
Interesting. And now, you being a general manager there, sort of maintaining this Hadoop infrastructure, what has been your sort of perspective on your vantage point on what you have seen in when you were as a budding entrepreneur, having succeeded vis-a-vis doing this so-called in a very enterprise environment, very big corporation. What was your sort of takeaway or differences that you have seen?
Well, I mean, very different. I mean, Teradata is something like $2.5 billion in revenue and 10,000 people, very global. Has incredible customers, incredible technology that's been successful for a very long time. So very different, I would say, company experience relative to the struggles of fighting it out as a startup trying to grow your business. I think it was interesting to continue to watch the Hadoop ecosystem evolve over time. And I think actually it probably became more and more clear over time that the decision to sell when we did probably was the right decision, simply because the stakes continued to raise. And ultimately, Hortonworks and Cloudera both went public, but neither IPO was really, that spectacular probably for the investors previous to that. I think in both cases, they ended up going public for, lower valuations than their last private rounds. So I think, Chris Lynch was one of our investors, and I think he was probably happy as well that we were able to get out when we did, and not sort of have that kind of trajectory that some of the others have had to struggle with. But yeah, no, I mean, Teradata was an awesome experience. I was also lucky to have great mentors there as well. Scott who's now the CTO of Hortonworks, actually, he was the president of Teradata Labs. He was really the one who ultimately bought Adapt. And so I got to work very closely with him for a while he was still there, and learned a tremendous amount from him. And then later Oliver Ratzesberger, who took over for Scott, also an incredible guy. I learned a lot from him as well.
Interesting. So thank you so much for sharing that story. Now let's talk about your current journey. What made you? So you did the startup, take that plunge, succeeded beautifully, got into this company, having a good life. Why jump back? Like, what's your perspective on that?
I think there's just something incredibly thrilling and fulfilling, honestly, of building something from scratch. It's a totally different experience. I think big companies have a lot of momentum, a lot of inertia. It's sort of hard to change direction very quickly. And by contrast, in a startup, you can change direction 5 times in one day, and sometimes that's what you need to do. I think as you're figuring out product market fit and adapting to the market, which is always changing. So I think there's something just incredibly exciting about that, and again, creating something from scratch and hopefully having an impact on the world in that way.
Interesting. So now walk us through Starburst. What is that, and if you can shed some light on what you're doing there.
Sure. So Starburst is very different in a lot of ways. Well, it's actually very much the same and very different, I guess I would say. In some ways, when I talk to friends, they're like, "This sounds like you're doing Hadapt again," because it is another SQL engine for Hadoop. But what's so different about it, I think, is both the way the company was started and also the product offering itself. In this case, we're focused on entirely an open source project called Presto, which was created at Facebook. It's super fast. We can talk about some of the benefits of Presto itself. But the company formation is also particularly unique. We ultimately actually got involved with Presto while we were at Teradata. It was one of the projects within my group in the Center for Hadoop at Teradata. And we actually became major committers to the project. In fact, we're the largest committers outside of Facebook to the Presto project. And I think we recently discovered that we've contributed close to a quarter of the entire code base, I think, in Presto is actually written by our team, which is pretty cool. And then just this past fall, actually, we decided to try to do this as an independent company with Teradata's blessing. So we have an important partnership there where they can continue to sell Presto support as well. We ultimately deliver it on the back end, which gives us the ability to continue to serve some incredible customers. So, we talked about the challenges of a startup winning, those big names initially. In this case, we get to start with them. So we have about 15, enterprise Fortune 500 customers, which are just awesome. There's obviously revenue that comes from that. So we don't have a need to go out and raise capital right away, which is also very refreshing. And we're dealing with a super popular open source project that just seems to be gaining momentum. Originally created at Facebook, then Netflix, Airbnb got involved. Now Uber, Dropbox, Twitter. I mean, the list just sort of goes on and on of leading companies using this technology. So it's a very interesting and different starting point. We're also starting with a complete engineering team, which is also a great advantage. So now we're just focused on sort of how do we grow and scale this business.
Interesting. So, what is Presto for our folks who are not aware of this?
Yep. So it is a SQL engine. Facebook actually created Hive back in the mid 2000s. So they were very early on this whole notion of thinking about Hadoop as a data warehouse. They may have been the only people thinking about this before Daniel Abadi, quite frankly, my co-founder from Hadapp. So, much respect to them and everything they've done. They ultimately realized pretty early on, as we did actually in our first company, that Hive just wasn't going to be fast enough to really deliver true ad hoc analytical, queries, being able to power BI tools, for example, sort of traditional enterprise analytics, just wasn't what Hive was really intended for at the time. It's still great for ETL workloads, long batch-oriented workloads. Hive is great, but for those sort of interactive queries, really not the ideal solution. So they created Presto as really a replacement or a successor project to that. Speed is sort of priority number one, but I think also what separates it from other SQL engines is the fact that from the beginning, it was designed with this concept of sort of separating the query engine from storage. So rather than having storage combined with your query engine, like a traditional database system where you store data in Oracle and run queries in Oracle, for example, you can actually store data in anything, anywhere. And I think that's what makes it so flexible. So, that can be any traditional Hadoop file format, Avro, Parquet, ORC file. It could be other database systems, MySQL, Postgres. It could be NoSQL systems like Cassandra, Mongo. There's connectors for those as well. And then I would say probably the fastest growing use case that we see is being able to access data in S3 directly or other S3 compatible object stores, whether that's on-prem object stores like Ceph from Red Hat, or cool new startups like Minio, if you've come across them, or if you're in Azure, blob storage. So it's kind of like the Swiss Army knife of SQL engines. It can query anything. It is open source, so you have that vendor neutrality, that sort of distribution neutrality, that cloud neutrality aspect, which I think customers are increasingly looking for, and gives you a lot of leverage. You can sort of deploy it in a multitude of different ways.
Interesting. So, great. So what I'm hearing is, so it's a great platform for SQL. It could, like, for cloud. So sorry. So if anyone is moving to cloud, Presto would be a great sort of engine for them. Am I hearing it right? So what's your take? Like, why is it effective for the cloud frameworks to use Presto, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, both cloud and on-prem. I would say on-prem, where we see it most often is probably somewhere where somebody has Hadoop as a file system, and they either want to query that, very quickly, or we see a lot of use cases on-prem where they want to join between two systems. So we built a connector for Teradata, for example. So you might have a Teradata system, or an IBM system, or Oracle system, or Microsoft SQL Server system, and you have data both in one of those systems and in HDFS, and you want to join tables across these systems. That's a great use case for Presto. But as for the cloud, yeah, I think that's probably the fastest growing area, simply because it feels like S3 or object stores in general are sort of becoming the new data lake. And if that's the new paradigm, where you're going to leave data in S3 and you want to be able to read it directly rather than having to load it into a database system first, or even without having to load it into EC2, I mean, you just leave it in S3. That's an awesome use case for Presto.
Interesting. And so what is Starburst's use case in Presto's ecosystem? What do you guys deliver on?
Yep. So, we're trying to be, the Presto company, essentially. And in doing so, we have, the largest team of committers outside of course, Facebook, who created the project. And we're able to offer enterprise support. So that's sort of, one reason, that's probably the first reason people discover us, is they want to deploy Presto in production, and they want a 24/7 support SLA. So we do that all the time. We also have our own distribution of Presto, by the way, which is a little bit more thoroughly tested than what you'll find on GitHub from the main branch. We do a lot of regression testing, and then we're always building and adding features to it that you'll find in our distribution first. So for example, just last week, we introduced a cost-based query optimizer for Presto. So suddenly performance is improving, has just improved by about 10 to 15x what it was just a couple weeks ago. And so that's a huge performance boost that you'll find in our distribution first. It'll ultimately go back into the main open source branch. We're continuing to commit to the main branch, and that's very important, I think, to our identity and who we ultimately want to be as sort of stewards of the community. But one of the reasons we hope customers think about using our distribution is you'll find it there first. And that's the distribution that you can get support for. So ultimately, it's our own distribution, it's support. You get some influence into the roadmap because we're obviously driving it in conjunction with our colleagues at Facebook. So that's sometimes of value to customers. We also offer training and services and so forth as well.
Interesting. So now, if say I'm an enterprise IT architect and I've been dealing with old school Oracle and IBM setups for my data processing need, and now I heard about this word called Presto. What do you suggest? Where should I start to start deploying?
Well, I would suggest, and I guess this sounds like a plug, but I'd say download our distribution. And the reason I say that is I think it's the easiest to deploy and get started with. We've been trying to pick up our pace in terms of writing blogs to sort of give tips and tricks on how to deploy these sorts of architectures. So you can certainly check out our blog. But then there's also a ton of stuff in the community. I would say if you search for Presto Netflix, Presto Airbnb, Presto Uber, you'll find some awesome engineering blogs of how they deploy it. Presto Facebook, of course. So there's a lot out there from major customers and how they're deploying it that I think you can learn from. There's also a Presto Google group that you can join. There's a Presto Slack. So there's a lot of different ways you can get involved in the community as well.
Interesting. So now you have quite a sort of in-depth experience in data warehousing solutions, having done 2 startups, one sort of multi-billion-dollar revenue company, working with them. So what's your take on the health of enterprise data? Like what are you seeing that the world is transforming to when it comes to dealing with enterprise data?
Yep. I mean, I think maybe the 2 biggest trends that I'm focused on right now are, one, just the move to the cloud. I mean, we've been talking about the cloud probably for close to a decade, but it's really happening right now. In the early days, there was more hype than substance. Today, it's very much a real thing. People are moving tons and tons of data to the cloud, moving new use cases to the cloud. And I think simultaneous to that, I think customers are getting very smart, I would say, about trying to create independent sort of future-proof architectures as they're thinking about building out their architectures. And by that, I mean choosing open source wherever possible, mixing and matching components that are pluggable and interchangeable, really creating leverage, quite frankly, relative to vendors. And I say this, obviously, we're a vendor to some extent, but I think this is a great time to be a customer, quite frankly. I think, the old days, you bought a very expensive system, you deployed it, and you were sort of stuck with it for a very long time. And I think in the new world, there's so many opportunities to create leverage. FINRA is an awesome example of this. They happen to be a very large Presto user, but they're also one that moved to the cloud in the last few years and really rethought their entire architecture in the process. And as a result, they've chosen to be very deliberate about the tools that they choose, wanting to maintain that leverage, everywhere they can, so that they can change components out. If one vendor becomes too expensive, they sort of have that infinite flexibility. They could move from one cloud to another. They could move from one technology to another, from one vendor to another. So I think that, in conjunction with this move to the cloud, are 2 really interesting trends. And then I'll just add to that, I guess, the notion of the object store becoming the default resting place for data. Again, whether that's S3 or other object stores, we're just seeing a ton of that as well.
Interesting. And now tell about what Presto is not good for. Like, so which kind of customers I should not even care about Presto? Or is there anything like that? Did you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. Who is it not good for? I mean, well, I guess it's worth stating up front that Presto is an analytical database system. Ultimately, it's not for transactional workloads. So you certainly wouldn't use it in place of a Cassandra or MongoDB type of use case. Those are definitely different use cases. I think there are also situations where, you might want to use Spark, let's say, for machine learning jobs that you're developing. Those are probably also not the right use cases. So really, Presto's focused on those analytical data warehousing style queries. That's really its bread and butter.
Interesting. Now, getting back to my previous question on sort of your perspective where the industry is heading, or it's transforming to right now, what is the future of enterprise data? Like from your vantage point, having involved in at least good chunk for the new transforming technologies, what do you think are the adoption rate in enterprise sector, and what do you think where we are heading to when it comes to enterprise data?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think if you're in this space, you're in the right place. I think you probably have infinite job security. I think there's going to be just tremendous data growth and new use cases to leverage all of that data. Obviously, AI is a very hot topic right now, but you also sort of need to get your big data infrastructure right before you can even do AI and machine learning types of use cases. So I think all of that is very big. I think increasingly, again, moving things to the cloud, making things as self-service and easy to use and deploy as possible is also important. I think there's going to be continued emphasis on trying to hire the right talent. I think that continues to be a gating factor for a lot of customers, unfortunately, at this point, is trying to acquire that talent. And if you're not Facebook or Google, that can be particularly challenging. And so we see a lot of customers struggle with that as well.
Interesting. And now getting back to your entrepreneurial journey, and now onto a second stint, right? So what are some of the parallels that you are seeing? And I think the market, so now you're more in open source space. Now previously you were more on proprietary angle. What are some of the parallels that you could draw, or what are some of the totally transformational aspect that you're seeing having onto your second stint on the startup journey?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, I do think, well, it depends on the type of company or the type of product you're offering. But I think if you're in a space where there are really good open source alternatives, I think it's increasingly hard to build a proprietary company unless, I think the one exception to that is if you're a really compelling SaaS offering, where part of the value that you're providing is basically you're eliminating the complexity of managing the infrastructure. So I think, like we're seeing Snowflake is doing pretty well in that respect. It's obviously not open source. There's really nothing open about it. I mean, its formats are proprietary and so forth, but they built a great database system and it is a SaaS offering. And so that model does seem to work. And the on-prem world, I think that's much harder at this point. I don't think you could really build a proprietary database system in the on-prem world as a new entrant at this point. I think that's really tough. There's just too many open source alternatives. I'm trying to think of what else. I think there's also a trend, or at least certainly a desire, to build business models that are more self-service in their nature, meaning that it starts with a visit to a website, which leads to a download, which leads to a sort of self-evaluation of the product. And ultimately, you can have an inside sales team reaching out to those folks and trying to convert them to paying customers, as opposed to sort of the traditional model of having expensive field sales teams in every major city. Which is expensive, longer sales cycles. They can be bigger deals, but there's a lot of expense and time associated with that. So I think trying to create more self-service, higher velocity business models is also very appealing.
Interesting. And so if I'm a startup in infrastructure space, in data management or data infrastructure, so would you suggest aligning with a open source initiative, or would give me better chances to getting a seat in the table when it comes to meeting with clients and enterprise prospects? Or do you think that the chances are still in my favor if I have an enterprise play?
Yeah, I mean, I think aligning with open source makes a lot of sense if the story makes sense with your product. Certainly, I think the beauty of open source, there can be challenges monetizing it, and I think you can look at other vendors. Red Hat's the only one who's done it like particularly well, and now I would actually say Amazon does a great job of monetizing open source that exists out there. But But I think the beauty of open source is that it has sort of a viral nature to it. I mean, it is the adoption is very organic and widespread. It's very easy for a engineer, let's say at a customer, to download an open source project and start working with it without having to go and get 10 approvals to go buy software. So I think open source has this natural tendency to be very pervasive. And if you can connect yourself to that in some way with whatever offering you have, I think that that probably does strengthen your story.
Interesting. By the way, thank you so much. That was really helpful. So, as a CEO or as a of a startup, what are some of the KPIs that you care about? If you can shed some light on that.
Well, I mean, revenue is the ultimate KPI, but I think in this startup in particular, given that we have an open source product, we have an open source distribution that's freely downloadable. Downloads is probably my most important KPI. Visits to the website is sort of an early indicator. I mean, that's important. So we are trying to drive traffic there as well by creating more useful content, blogging more, and so forth. But ultimately, downloads means and a touch point where someone is actually taking this seriously and evaluating Presto. They may be doing their own internal POC. They may be playing with it on their laptop. All of those are, I think, really strong indicators of interest. And so that's the metric that I probably look at, most importantly. And if we can, continue to see growth on the download side, I think ultimately that will translate to revenue as well.
Interesting. And so now we are onto our last sort of stint on this interview. So let's talk about you for a few minutes. So what has been some of the tenets of your success? So if I say your ingredients, one to three sort of aspect that has really helped you stay sane so far, what would that
be? Staying sane. That's a good question. I mean, I wouldn't say that I did everything perfectly in the first startup. I think maybe some of the lessons learned in terms of answering that question are trying to find some balance in your life. I think like exercise is important. Spending time with friends and family is very important. I'm the first to admit I did not do a good job of either of those during my first company. So no matter how sort of mentally driven you are, I think physically it can wear you down if you don't do those things. So that's definitely one major example of I guess maturing as an entrepreneur. I think is taking the time to sort of do those recharge type of activities. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, I think trying to think of what else I would say to that. I mean, I think that's probably the biggest lesson learned along the way. Hiring great people is always an important challenge as well. We're very lucky to already have a great team that we're starting with in this case, so that actually makes that job a lot easier. If I had to go out and hire 15 great engineers from scratch, that would be a lot harder. But we certainly had to do that the first time, and it's hard, especially right now. The market is just incredibly hot, so it's hard to get people to think about switching. And as a startup, it's very hard to compete with the Googles and the Facebooks of the world, just in terms of the comp that they offer and so forth. So, but that's always an important thing. I think the team that you build, finding the right people, hiring the right people, and keeping the right people is really important.
Okay, interesting, and thank you for sharing that. So, do you have any favorite reads that you could share with our listeners and viewers?
Well, on the topic of, I guess, entrepreneurship, I really like The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz. I've read plenty of sort of business books and startup books over the years, and that's probably my favorite simply because it's so practical. I think a lot of business books can be kind of high level and hand wavy, and his is just very, very down to earth, practical, like real lessons that you would actually deploy tomorrow. And unfortunately, he wrote that book maybe 2/3 of the way through Hidap, so I didn't get it in the beginning. I wish I had. So I read it too late, I guess. He wrote it too late. It's but no, it's an awesome book, and I would definitely recommend it to anyone doing this for the first time.
Interesting, and thank you for sharing that. Now we're at the last leg. With that, thank you so much, Justin, by the way, for being really candid with your time and sharing interesting aspects of your entrepreneurial journey. Before we part ways, love to have your closing remark for our listeners and viewers. What would you want them to take away from this, your journey?
Well, I mean, I think if someone is aspiring to be an entrepreneur or build a business in this space or any space, I think probably the biggest key, I guess this goes back to maybe your question, sort of keys to success. I think the biggest key is just persistence, to be honest with you. I don't think it's talent. I don't think it's intellect. I don't think it's creativity. I think it's just persistence. I think this is an inherently very hard occupation to be in. Probably among the most challenging that I can think of in terms of just everything that it requires and the inherent stress that comes with it. And I think those that succeed are the ones who keep pushing, who never give up, and ultimately, get it across the finish line at the end of the day. So that sort of stubbornness, I think, is really important. I've seen that in a lot of successful entrepreneurs, not just myself, that I've watched. And I would say that's probably the key ingredient. I don't know how you train that. That might be something that you either have or you don't have. But I think that's one important thing, to sort of look in the mirror and see if you have that aspect. Additionally, if you're in just the big data space in general, I would say it's an amazing time, again, to be in this space. I think this is a great time in particular to be consumers and customers of these technologies. I think open source has just dramatically improved over the last 10 years. And there's so many, great ways to build architectures that will stand the test of time without necessarily having to spend a lot of money. And I think if you can do that, it allows you to do a lot more things with the budget that you do have, which is great.
Interesting. With that, thank you so much, Justin, for an amazing session for our community's aspiring entrepreneurs to take away from this. You're always welcome on the podcast. I'd love to have you back and discussing your journey on Starburst. Wish you nothing but luck in its success. And if anyone wants to get in touch with Justin and his startup and learning more about Presto and Starburst, I'll put the link on the description so they can check them out. And Justin, again, thank you so much, and good conversing with you on this.
Great. My pleasure. It was great to be with you.
Awesome. So
I thought I was sick of home, but actually I was homesick. Never really knew that I would have to grow up so quick. I'm so uncomfortable, don't know anybody here. Just a couple dudes that I met once, that's it. And I go into the booth feeling nervous. Got butterflies in my stomach like I'm so worthless. Is the mic on? I don't know how to work this. Inside I'm breaking down, I hope I'm not up on the